Today, we're going to study a concept called variables. And variables are a very important concept in programming. No program can be created without variables. We use variables in programming to store data, and the type of data that will be stored in a variable is what we decide. I've already made a complete dedicated video on data types where we studied all the different types of data types. So, if you haven't watched that video yet, please go and watch it. First, let's understand variables. To explain variables, I'll give you an example. Imagine you have a game, and in that game, there are enemies and players. Now, suppose we need to store how many enemies are in the game. How will we store that? For that, we need to create a variable, and the name of that variable will be enemy count. What could be the data type of this enemy count? Now, you might think it won't be a float because the enemy count won't be in decimals. So what can we do? It could be an integer. Here, we'll write int, then enemy count. We can leave enemy count like this and assign it later to specify how many enemies there are. We can assign the number of enemies anywhere. Like down here, we can write inside start match that enemy count equals 10, or we can directly assign its value where we declare the variable itself. So you need to understand that when we declare any variable, we first write its type and then its name, and that's how it gets declared. If we want to assign values to that variable, we can directly use the equal sign there and write its value. And this assignment can be done anywhere in the program. But if I tell you about declaring, we declare a variable only once, but we can assign it different values at different places. For example, if I gave it a value of 10 at the start, and now we print it, you'll see 10 printed. Now, suppose a little further down, we change enemy count to 20. After doing that, you'll see its value has changed again. So now you must have understood how to declare a variable and how to assign a value to it. But now, let's assume we didn't assign any value to the variable. What will it print? What the compiler does here is that every data type has a default value. When you declare a variable, it automatically gets a default value. For example, if we wrote in enemy count and just printed it, what would you get? You get a default value of 0. So now you must have understood that every data type has a default value, and you can even see a full table showing what the default value is for each type. If you don't assign anything, you'll see the default value printed. And along with this, there are some rules you need to follow when working with variables. You can't name a variable after a data type. For example, you can't write int after int or string after int. This means you can't use any keyword that's reserved for data types as a variable name. When you're naming a variable, you can use alphabets, underscores, and then numeric values, but the first letter of the variable must be an alphabet or an underscore. Let me explain this with an example. If I want to name a variable, I can put an underscore before enemy count, and that will work. I can write enemy with a capital E or enemy with a small e, but I can't write one before E or something like 0 enemy count. That would make the variable name invalid. So now you must have understood that if you're declaring a variable, you can use alphabets, numbers, and underscores. But one thing to note is that a numeric value can't come at the start. However, I'd suggest that when you create a variable, think carefully about its name. Don't just write something like ph if you mean player health. Write it properly as player health and use camel case. Keep the first word in lowercase and the second word capitalized. For example, with player health, player is in lowercase and health has a capital H. With enemy count, enemy is lowercase and count is capitalized. This is important because if you have a large code base with many lines, it becomes difficult to understand if you've written something like PH or EC. It'll be hard for you to understand, and it'll be hard for others working with you to understand too. Now, let's understand how memory allocation works for a variable. When you declare a variable or assign a value to it, what the computer does in the back end is it allocates a space in memory equal to the size of that data type. I'll explain this. For example, we took a variable enemy count, and its data type was integer. The size of an integer is 4 bytes. As soon as you declare it, 4 bytes of space in memory are allocated for this variable. Then, whenever you assign something to that variable, it gets stored in that allocated memory. That's why we also call variables identifiers. Variables and memory are a big topic, and we'll cover it in detail in the future. How many types of memory there are, and how variables are stored in those memories. We'll study all of that in detail later. For now, let's understand the types of variables. The first type is an instance variable, the second is a static variable, and the third is a local variable. Instance variables are those that are different for every object of class. Let's say in our game, we have an enemy class. In the game, we have many enemies, and all of them use this class. But the health variable for each enemy will be different. For example, one enemy's health might be 100, another's might be 100, another's might be 100, all starting at 100. But if I hit the first enemy, its health decreases. It doesn't mean the second or third enemy's health decreases. They still have 100. So what happens here? Even though it's the same class, each instance is different. If we have 4 enemies, the enemy class is applied to all 4, but each one has its own instance. Each one is a separate object. If we change the value in one, it only changes in that object's memory allocation. So now you must have understood that instance variables are different for every object of class. If only enemy 1 takes damage, only its health variable decreases. Enemy 2, enemy 3, and enemy 4 aren't affected. Next, let's understand what static variables are. To declare a static variable, one thing you need to note is that you have to write the static keyword before it. As soon as you add static, memory is allocated for it only once. No matter how many objects you create, the memory is allocated in just one place, and any changes you make will reflect there. If we change the value of a static variable in one place, it reflects everywhere. We should only use static variables when we know there won't be separate instances. It's a single value that's stored for everyone. Let me give you a real-life example. Suppose there's a school, and the school has one name. Inside that school, there might be different classes, and the kids might study in different classes, some in 1st grade, some in 4th, some in 5th. But if you ask them the name of their school, they'll all give the same answer. So if you want to store that, you'd use a static variable. Now you must have understood the major difference between static variables and normal instance variables. Instance variables allocate separate memory for each object, but a static variable takes just one block of memory, and that's where the value is stored. If you store another value in it, the old value gets replaced with a new one. Now let's understand local variables. Local variables are those that we can use inside a specific block, and they aren't accessible outside that block. For example, suppose we made a function called start. Inside that function, we declared a variable. We can't access it outside in update or in another method. If we create a variable inside this method, we can only access it within that method. These are called local variables. There's also another type of variable called a const. When we put the const keyword before a value, it becomes unchangeable. You can't modify it anymore. As soon as you add const, it starts behaving like a static variable, and this value remains the same for all objects of the class. You can access it with the class name, just like we access static variables and constants with their names. So in today's session, we learned about variables. In the next video, we'll study operators. If you have any doubts, let me know in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next video.